Well, hello and welcome back to the CBI Conference on International Trade, which we're broadcasting from the ITN headquarters here in central London. You are very welcome. Now, for this next discussion, delighted to be joined by Natalie Black, Trade Commissioner for Asia Pacific. Also, Janice Charette, Canadian High Commissioner to the UK. Welcome, Janet. Simon Paris from Finastra and Jenny Mundy from Visa, our conference sponsor, of course. We're very grateful. And Josh Hardy from the CBI. Now, during this discussion, we're going to be exploring in some detail how companies are having to react to the obvious consumer behavioural changes being made because of COVID-19, as well as the importance of digital trade. Josh, it's probably the understatement of the century. What a crazy year it's been, the changes that we've all had to make in our lives, but businesses particularly. Yeah. How's it looking from where you're sitting?
Well, it's extraordinary. And firstly, I really would like to thank all of our panel. To have people here from Kuala Lumpur to Canada is brilliant. And Jenny and Visa, thanks so much for the huge support you've given sponsoring the conference. It's really appreciated. But yeah, it is amazingly challenging times. It was beforehand, of course. You had already, the battle between the big beasts of China and the US and the way that sucked so many other countries in. You had the debate about the rise of Asia. You had, of course, a little local difficulty between the UK and the EU and the need to get that Brexit deal over the line to boost business confidence. But then along came the pandemic. And that has, in many ways, wrought havoc on so many different businesses. It has disrupted demand, supply, it has drained cash flows, and it's been incredibly challenging for businesses in the UK, but all over the world. It's a shared problem. But I suppose, and what I'm really looking forward to hearing today, is that old phrase, out of destruction comes rebirth. There's so much that we've all learned during this period. There's so much that we can take forward. It may feel hard right now, but as we look forward to 2021 and beyond, what can we do to change that dialogue around change, to embed sustainability, fairness, and to show that globalization really is a force for good? So I'm sure we'll hear plenty about that today, but back to you, Daisy.
We do have so much ground to cover. And of course, we're not at the end of this crisis. We're in the middle of it. So trying to work out where we've been, where we are and where we're going and how we can help. There's so much to discuss. But Josh, thank you for setting it up so brilliantly. So how is the pandemic impacting on business and consumers in Asia Pacific? Natalie, tell us how things look from where you are.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Daisy, for including me today. And what a fantastic panel. I can only echo Josh's comments. Firstly, I think it's important to recognise the global context that we're all operating in. So if you look at the figures coming out from UNCTAD predicting a 20% drop in overall trade, FDI down potentially 40%, and a figure that's particularly important in this part of the world, potentially a 100 billion drop in remittances. So what does that mean specifically for Asia Pacific? So I think one of the key trends that we have seen is really a focus on supply chain, and in three ways. Firstly, a real effort to boost resilience. And that's something that we've picked up actually out here as part of the UK government. So we've launched a new research proposal with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to really understand our mutual areas of challenge, but also opportunity when it comes to supply chains. The second area of focus is a real appetite to diversify trade relations. And you see that with CPTPP. We've been very vocal about our interest in joining that. But also you're hearing across the region that there's potentially going to be good news around RCEP towards the end of the year. And lastly, I think you've seen a shift in attitude to foster a real appetite for wider cooperation, particularly in the area of digital trade. And I hope that's something we can cover today.
And how does that description of life in that region compare to what you're seeing in North America?
Let me also start by saying thanks for including me in the panel today, and great to see such amazing colleagues on this panel this morning. I think that, what your point, Daisy, that we're not through this yet. So the economic impact, I think, is yet to be fully understood. Are we in a V, a U, an L, whatever the shape of the recovery is? I think we have seen a rebound faster than people were expecting so far. I think a part of that is due, if I look at the case of Canada, to absolutely tremendous economic supports that have been put in place in a unprecedented is probably another word we use too much, unprecedented speed, wrapping around businesses and wrapping around individuals in a way that that really is trying to shelter them from some of the worst of the economic impacts of all of this. It has been very uneven across sectors. I think this is a story we'll see country after country. In Canada, travel, hospitality, arts and culture, of course, sectors very, very hard hit. But opportunities, health and life sciences really taking off. The fintech sector is another example. So it's uneven, and it's also uneven across individuals. We've seen knowledge workers who were able to transition very quickly to working from home, but a lot of frontline workers working in the service sectors, healthcare workers, not able to do the same thing. So inequality, I think, is a topic we'll come back to. Companies, I think, really focused on how they kind of drive cost out and try and identify new sources of revenue. And so, the creativity and innovation that we've all been hoping for has been accelerated in some ways through all of this. And I think that hopefully that will turn into opportunities for us all going forward. And I think the last example I would give you is, the whole retail online, which was lagging in Canada compared to what I experienced here in the UK as example. That's just exploding.
It's so interesting. Some unexpected consequences, some very obvious and expected consequences. And of course, so much of it depends on the reaction that businesses have and the reaction that governments have and consumers have. Simon, from your business point of view, tell us what it's been like for you and what you need.
Yeah, sure. So I think the High Commissioner said it very well, that there are certain industries or sectors that have been net beneficiaries of what's happened because of COVID. You mentioned healthcare, life science, but also financial technology. The phrase we use internally in my company is that COVID has brought the future forward. Everything digital, everything that was in our roadmap has been incredibly accelerated. So all of the buzzwords du jour, cloudification, platformification, digitization, everything has been massively accelerated. That's for knowledge workers. Now, everything physical has been massively reconfigured. So everything digital accelerated, everything physical reconfigured. Let me give you an example. On March the 16th, which is when I think the WHO declared the global pandemic, we had 800 on-premise projects at our client site. Within 2 weeks, we had 0, right? So everything had to move to remote working, digital engagement, digital interaction, digital integration. Whole new work patterns had to come around. So what do we need? We need.
Oh, I think we might have lost Simon. We'll try and get that line back up. Obviously, it's one of the trials and tribulations of doing the conference in this way. Whilst we try and get the line back up, we'll go to Jenny. And Jenny, from your point of view, obviously what Simon was saying there about how businesses respond, it resonates in some ways, because obviously businesses have to make money, they have to find new ways of working, but also they're customers are behaving in different ways. And I just wonder, from Visa's perspective, how it's been for you, both as far as running the business is concerned, but also the behavior that you've noticed and witnessed changing in customers.
Yeah, thanks, Daisy. And I just sort of amplify Simon's point really around the digitization. And look, we've seen a dramatic change in, and we think a permanent shift in consumer spending habits. We know from research that actually 66%, so about 2/3 of us are saying our spending habits are going to change for good. And as you said, we know already from the Bank of England numbers that we're already back to being slightly ahead in terms of spend and consumption of where we were in 2019. But oh my goodness, is the makeup of that very different? And that's true not just in this country, but around the world. I mean, we had the story from Canada. I mean, if I just give you a few stats, I like a few stats. Greece and Romania, for example, saw an increase in e-com payments of over 60% in June. In Belgium and in Ireland, so very close to home, almost 40% of our cardholders in those countries didn't shop online prior to March of this year, and now they are. So we have seen this massive acceleration to digital. We do think it's going to stick, and there have definitely been segments that have benefited from this. So essential spend categories, food and grocery, as we know, our lives are transformed in terms of the number of deliveries and who we get deliveries from to our doors, and that's a universal trend.
And Josh, I just wonder how these trends are affecting, obviously, CBI members, but also, Janice was talking about how some people are benefiting, some people are being damaged, some businesses are benefiting, some are being damaged, but also there are geographical areas that are doing better than others, both globally and within the UK, particularly think of a north-south divide, and the way that I just want, and generationally, obviously, older generations are going to find it much harder to do everything online rather than younger generations. And I just wonder how all these new changes are affecting CBI members.
Well, it's incredibly complicated. And I think economists, of course, always like to put letters to things. And we've had V's, we've had U's. I think more recently we've had a K, yeah. Exactly. But if you think exactly as you've said about all these nuances, it ends up looking a bit like Mr. Messi. I mean, there are so many different changes out there. I think businesses have been extraordinary. What they have started with, the experience, of course, as we've heard, has been totally different for different businesses. In manufacturing, the difference between a car manufacturing and pharma. In creative industries, a games producer, many of whom have had a very successful time, versus an international touring company. Huge differences, but a lot of commonality. And the businesses we've spoken to have started with their employees. And I think that's really, really important, because that conversation about how do you keep your employees safe, whether that's traveling the world or whether that's just coming into work locally, has changed for so many businesses. That's changed the nature of their dialogue with their employees, and that will actually pay off in future years. So I think for all of these challenges, we can look for benefits. We've heard about supply chain disruption. What we've seen a lot of business, I've learnt more words ending in shoring in the last few months, nearshoring, offshoring, onshoring, than in the last 10 years. But what we've also seen is amazing innovation, use of blockchain technology. So of course, to identify those weak spots in your supply chain and act on them early, but also to look at the ethical supply chain. How do you actually find issues of human slavery or sustainability? Again, something that we can really take forward. And on demand, yes, huge digitization, but also think of all the businesses that were manufacturing and actually are now producing PPE or ventilators, or now stepping into testing. And that sort of innovation, that sort of agility will stand us in really good stead. So there are massive differences, and they are very, very challenging within the UK and outside. But if firms are really doing their best to maintain their jobs and adapt their models, then we stand the best chance of evening that out over time.
Yeah. I just want to pick up on that supply chain element that Josh was talking about. And Natalie, as far as the crisis in Asia Pacific is concerned, what was the impact on supply chains, and also that point about diversification away from China? Do you think this has propelled that?
Thanks, Daisy. Yes, I think it's sped up the amount of attention and energy going into this issue. Josh mentioned right at the beginning that pre-COVID-19, the trade tensions that we have seen between the US and China were playing out in this part of the world, and COVID-19 has accelerated all of that. And in practice, what I think that means is that supply chains has become a board level issue. Boards expect to know where their vulnerabilities are in terms of where are they sourcing from? Are those supply chains resilient? Are they reliable? But also rethinking cost. Traditionally, the view was to keep costs as low as possible in many sectors when it came to supply chains. And now boards are having to balance the issue of resilience versus cost. So as a consequence, I think across the world, we're seeing more and more companies shifting the source of their supply. E&Y did a report on this recently suggesting 25% of companies will be doing that going forward. But specifically in Asia Pacific, you feel it a bit more. So on average, about half of the companies in the globe are thinking about moving their overall supply chains or making some change. But in Asia Pacific, that number looks like more like 67%. And that brings a lot of opportunities. So particularly for Malaysia, where I'm talking to you from now, but also Vietnam, which has been pretty successful in terms of managing the impact of COVID-19 and is now reaping the benefits in terms of both companies and governments looking to supply chain opportunities. So Japan, for example, is incentivizing a number of its companies to move operations to Vietnam. But the way I've described it there makes it sound like that's quite a simple endeavor. You can't just decide one day that you're going to shift your supply chains. And so although the appetite might be there, in fact, this could be quite a slow run process. And that's why we shouldn't take too many knee-jerk decisions at this stage and need to take a while to assess the impact. Because again, as you said, Daisy, we are still in the middle of this. We are still understanding the real impact of COVID-19.
Natalie, thank you. Simon, I saw you nodding there about along to some of those comments that Natalie was making. And I just wondered, just picking up on that last point about it's very difficult to make business decisions if you're really not sure what's coming down the line. And obviously, most countries around the world are now grappling with a second wave of some sort or another. But none of us know what it's going to look like, if it's going to be the same as the first wave. And I wonder if the experience of the last few months is helping businesses to tackle these problems that Natalie was talking about, supply chain changes, whatever it might be, and whether having some sort of crystal ball is easier now or not.
Yeah, I certainly don't know if it's easier, but picking up on what Natalie and Josh were both saying. So to Natalie's point about people are reconsidering how they look at costs, this is because they're reconsidering how they think about optionality, and it's because they're thinking about how they price risk. So the risk to a supply chain, the optionality of having capabilities in other countries, it really is a board level discussion. So I completely concur and see what Natalie is seeing. What Josh kind of added is also something that is occurring, and I think we should all encourage it to occur more, which is a dialogue around open and fair and sustainable and inclusive types of trade. I think that's incredibly important. One of the things that Natalie said in her first remarks is the massive reduction in trade equals keeping people in poverty for much longer than otherwise would have been the case. Without trade, or with more trade, we can bring those people out of poverty. So I think both things are very important board level topics. One is optionality, cost and risk, and the other is doing well by doing good. We need to make sure that the world promotes itself out of poverty and encourages inclusiveness.
Janice, I wonder what your position on what Simon was saying would be, given that that is very much a top-level discussion to be having, a global, international, political level. And with your Canadian hat on, how do you view the rest of the world having or not having that discussion?
I would say that, we're really at a point where we're seeing two forces pulling against each other. We are seeing, countries in some cases turning inwards. We're seeing rising of protectionism and so on. The questions around kind of economic security and a pressure to maybe make sure that they have domestic capabilities. But at the same time, what this disease has shown us is that global linkages, we're all in this together. So global linkages are really, really vital. So, one of the things that Canada is very committed to and been active about is promoting this as a time to even reinforce open markets and free trade. We got to reform the international institutions that are at the heart of this. So reform of the World Trade Organization, make sure that it's effective. But I think that that's, part of a government response which will actually build resilience, and I completely agree with Simon, open markets, free trade, those are the secrets to prosperity and security for our citizens. Turning inward is really not the answer.
So when you talk about building resilience, what do you specifically mean? So if you think about obviously it's something that a lot of company boards talk about building resilience, but it's something that, governments talk about as well. What does it specifically mean?
I think what we're seeing right now is unprecedented investments by governments in their economy and their societies right now. So resilience can be enhanced through those investments if we're doing this in a way that is about long-term competitiveness. Investments in things like infrastructure, in housing, taking advantage of these incredibly low interest rates right now means that governments can actually make these investments that will have long-term payoffs. Also, the point Josh made about doing this in a way that really reinforces sustainability. You know, we're on the road to a global climate change conference here in the UK next year. How are we building back better in a way that's more sustainable? Identifying opportunities out of that, including a transition to net zero emissions economies, investments in renewables. You know, Canada is a fantastic source of critical minerals that we know are really critical ingredients in zero emission vehicles. I guess my last point is around resilience. I have to say a word about young people. I think that, you know, your point, older people may have difficulty adjusting younger people to the online world, younger people less. Younger people are really being hit hard. And so, you know, governments, I think, when we think about resilience, have to think about the resilience of our workforce of the future, and that's really all about young people.
And this is something that obviously a lot of politicians, a lot of business leaders have been talking about. And I mean, it might seem like a small point, but even the way that people work, we've talked about digitization, we've talked about AI and whatever, but if we talk about literally working from home, talk about younger employees, how are they meant to learn on the job if they're sitting in their bedroom, if they're literally not working with people who can teach them, you know, how to do things by showing and learning? And I do think that's one of the things that politicians and business leaders are going to have to grapple with in this post-COVID. Well, Josh, maybe if it's something that you're
Yeah, we've talked a lot about it, and it's one of those issues where there are huge potential benefits. I mean, I think flexible working was something that was growing anyway, but actually, if we're honest, there are a few CEOs who thought, no, working from home isn't really working, is it? I think that has changed dramatically now. And I think the realization that it doesn't necessarily, it can, but it doesn't necessarily affect productivity. Productivity can be higher, that it can be very good for inclusivity because people with different home circumstances or different regions aren't restricted from their jobs, but it is not cost-free. Some people, their home environment doesn't support it. Some people, particularly, we've at the CBI had lots of people joining. What's their experience been like? They haven't met their colleagues. That creativity, even the meetings, the discussions that we have with government, sometimes they're better face to face. So I think the challenge is, how do we actually find that hybrid model? And at the same time, the reality is there are ecosystems that have built up around offices. Whether it's the creative industries, whether it's hospitality, whether it's retail. They've had a short, sharp shock, and they don't know what the end state is yet. So if you're a sandwich shop round the corner from here, you don't know whether to go and move to a local high street, some of which are doing very well, or whether to actually stick. So we need to try and find that balance quickly so that the ecosystems can adapt as well. But I think there's, again, another positive to be had there, but we have to do it very, very carefully.
Yeah. Jenny, I wanted to bring you in both on the resilience question that I was just talking to Janice about, and also on this behaviour, not just consumer behaviour, but different behaviours within the workplace and how that will have a knock-on to business.
Yeah, I think from a resilience perspective, the first thing I'd say is that a crisis, while it's a terrible, terrible thing, it often brings out the best in people and businesses, and I think the sort of cooperation that I see happening certainly across the UK, whether it's with government or businesses and consumers as well, I think is very encouraging. I think there's a lot going on in communities to support people. I think resilience as well. You know, if we think about making our own individual businesses resilient, that in itself generates a bit of a weak spot. So we should do that, and we must do that, and we are doing that. But I think we get more resilient when we think about how we can work better and closer with each other. So that if one of my major clients, one of the major issuers, for example, has a problem, how can I stand in for them, and maybe vice versa. So actually, we're building resilience end to end. I think that's one thing that we're certainly working hard on. And when we run exercises, for example, on resilience, we'll do that industry wide rather than just an internal view. And I think, like all things, it's a bit of a muscle. You've got to practice using it if in the event that you ever need it. I think the other thing I'd say is there is definitely, in some aspects, resilience built into global networks and systems in a way that if you localize too much, you miss out on. So, for example, when you think about cyber, cyber is all about now through AI methodologies looking for trends and abnormalities. Now, the more data that you have, the better you are able to spot that. And so I think working globally and having open networks in those sorts of aspects is actually advantageous. And if this sort of shift to nationalization definitely has some downsides and they can be concerning. I think on a consumer side, certainly what we've been looking at doing more and more in a crisis to help consumers be resilient is think about the role we can play in education. So whether it's just how to shop safely online. I mean, a lot of people who go online to shop for the first time, that's kind of a scary place because you read in the newspapers about, horror stories and you think you're going to get stung. So really giving people some simple top tips for doing that safely, I think, is an important part to play as well. Lastly, on workplaces, again, I think work has fundamentally changed for good. I think that's a fantastic thing. I think there's a lot of positives in that. And most companies who've been surveying their staff, I think a lot of staff are very happy about that, particularly in this country where the average commute is 1 hour each way. And I think work will change. I don't think we'll ever go back to being all in the office. Clearly, this is not ideal either, but some form of hybrid where we think carefully about actually what do we need to go into an office or into a space together to do. And that can be, whether it's new employees, whether it's collaboration on certain points, or whether it's making sure that particularly as Janice says, those sort of early years career people are getting the sort of input and advice and hands-on time that they need. But I think we need to think differently about why we go together to work. We don't need to go there to open a laptop and sit at a desk and work all day. Work's something we do, not a place we go.
And Natalie, just thinking about lessons that we can learn either from things done well or mistakes that have been made. And again, not businesses and governments and politicians. Given that Asia Pacific was ahead of Europe in getting the pandemic and reacting to the pandemic and coming back up again, what lessons do you think have been learned, or we can learn from you, from both businesses and leaders?
Well, firstly, I think we mustn't underestimate the pace of change. Today, we've been talking about so many different areas, whether that's the impact on work, whether that's the impact on the daily commutes, making it very real for everyone. And I think one of the challenges for government is trying to keep up with that change in terms of developing policy and planning for the long term. And collectively in this part of the world, I think there's a recognition that it's very difficult to predict the future. None of us have a crystal ball, but it's going back to those underlying trends that we've been hearing so much about today. So if, again, I focus on the digital economy, pre-COVID-19, the digital economy out here in Southeast Asia tripled over the last 4 years. It's now expected to increase so much so that 70% of the population will be online by the end of the year. That's 5 years faster than it was expected. But that does mean that the challenges we were all aware of and talking pre-COVID-19 have really come into the fore. Issues like digital skills, for example, which are hugely in demand across the region. And of course, we're seeing that back in the UK. You might have seen the report that Tech Nation put out during London Tech Week, which highlighted there are now 90,000 vacancies a week in the UK in the tech sector. And I think the real opportunity for all of us here is around digital trade. It's recognizing that more and more trade is going to be online, but also the importance of the digital aspect of trade, the use and movement of data. And of course, the companies represented here today are absolute experts in this. And so I think one of the challenges for all of us is to understand understand how we can make sure that we are leveraging these opportunities through initiatives like the Digital Trade Network, which we've launched out here in Asia Pacific, which focuses on bringing UK tech companies out to this part of the world. The next generation of unicorns, we hope, will grow and expand here, but it will also identify investment, for example, and cutting across borders in those kinds of ways will bring resilience to economies, which of course is the big theme I think we're all talking about today.
Absolutely. Simon, I saw you agreeing with Natalie there, and I just wonder, from where you sit, your view on digital trade and the cash flow issues that follow on from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we handle about 6% of world trade finance every day. So we have a privileged position to see what's happening. And when you talk about digital trade, it really is focusing on removing sources of friction, trying to move to a seamless integration. So everything that was previously physical or documented or in paper is now moving over to digitization. And that may invoke new technologies like ocular character recognition, so you can actually scan documents directly in, much more focus on trust and provenance and the origin of a good or service, much more focus on the legal entity identifiers of who you're actually transacting with, much more visibility into the supply chain itself, so you can really optimize routes and think about sustainability. So a lot of focus on digital trade.
Jenny, any other tips that you've picked up along the way during this crisis? Or, as I was saying to Natalie, mistakes that you've seen people make that we could benefit from learning the lessons from?
I think the big thing, and maybe a little focus particularly on small business, because small businesses represent over half of the European GDP, and whatever happens and whatever letter of the alphabet we're playing with or experiencing, small businesses are going to actually be one of the main drivers out of this. And I think the big thing for small business is to help them go online. And those we're seeing being successful are the ones that are innovating and changing their business model. And of course, a lot of them are doing that extremely well, because many entrepreneurs in that sector. But I think the more that we can do to help them go online, the better. And certainly, we're partnering with a lot of great organisations right the way around the world. But maybe I'll name two out of the UK and Ireland. So Shop Happy, Totally Locally, who are really trying to help the high street go online, in particular, and towns go online. I mean, we all care about our local communities. And you don't become a butcher because you are really interested in an expert in tech. You become one because you're passionate about your product and you like interacting with people. So, I think there's some great organizations now trying to help high streets go online. And I think putting our weight in any way, shape or form we can behind them makes a big difference.
Janice, I think Jenny makes a very good point about your average retailer, your average butcher shouldn't be expected to be a tech expert. But one of the things I've noticed from interviewing politicians for the last 25 years or so is that very few of them are tech experts either. And it's become particularly obvious in the last 5 or 10 years as many politicians seem to be playing catch up with the tech world, and particularly now that it's with COVID making it even more important. And I wonder what your experience is of that interplay between politics and digital and tech, and whether the politicians know what's needed to help businesses.
Well, I think what certainly in Canada, a key ingredient in kind of making sure that gap doesn't disadvantage the country is the remarkable collaboration that's going on between business and government, the ongoing consultation, the outreach, and making sure that policy is really informed by the needs of businesses right across the spectrum. I think that, that is informing both how we kind of mitigate some of the risks, in order to be able to survive in this fast forward to the digital age. We got to think about broadband access. There's lots of parts of Canada right now, and I suspect still here in the UK, where, to be able to be online, to shop, to study, whatever, you have to have access to broadband, to run conferences like this. Not everybody has access to it in a reliable, high-speed way. Access to childcare to be able to support working from home, working in these new ways. But also we've got to rethink, okay, so what is the transportation system of the future? How do we collaboratively, business and government, work together to invest massive investments in reskilling that are going to be necessary to capture these benefits? So I think it's really, we're all going to have a challenge keeping up, and only by working together, both government and business, but also countries working together to make sure that really what we see is an inclusive approach to growth going forward, that everybody can really benefit. That's really the way of the future.
Josh, if we exhaust Jenny's butcher example a little bit more, but what Janice was saying is absolutely right. If we've got, let's say it's a market town butcher, he or she is trying to get online. If he doesn't have fibre optic, if he doesn't know how to build, or know somebody who knows how to build a website, as Janice was saying, even certainly the skills issue is a big one. Childcare potentially be an issue. There are so many issues which he or she doesn't have control over, and the politicians on the whole will have, in partnership with business, but will have control over those. And how can they do what's best and what's needed for businesses at the moment to catch up?
Well, sort of core CBI territory, so thank you. Look, I think the first thing, we've said it before, is let's not forget the urgency of now. The more businesses that make it through this pandemic, the more businesses will be able to trade on the other side. And for our key exporting industries, I've mentioned creative industries, but also education, aviation, all still suffering really, really sectoral specific restrictions, as well as those in local lockdowns. So we've had huge success with the job retention scheme, with the JSS, with other mechanisms. Let's not stop. Let's not leave our job half done. Help those businesses that need it. So that's the first stage. But then you also need to think longer term. We've seen the Prime Minister stand up on Tuesday and start to lay out a vision for the long-term future of this company, a sustainable vision of this country. Let's underpin that with real clarity on training. Lots of talk about good training schemes. Let's actually deliver them so that we have those digital skills, those skills of the future, so that those people who do lose their jobs, because some will, actually are very, very quickly trained back in to help us build for the future. That will help a huge number of businesses. Let's get the research and investment environment right. Let's make sure we're driving innovation and driving that digital infrastructure that you talk about. I think the third thing I'd say is let's actually have a comprehensive trade and export strategy. We're nearly there. We can take those final steps. We're almost the new kid on the block in this area. We want to be the new kid setting the standards, being popular when we arrive at school, not hiding in the shadows. We need a really good trade and export strategy. CBI document on the website laying out our thoughts. But all of that matters, but it's not just the government's job. It is business's job as well. So absolutely agree with Janice. Policy is better when it is done jointly between business and government. We've really learned that in the pandemic. And also business can help itself. There are some brilliant examples of networks being set up where businesses are sharing skills, whether through the supply chain, whether in the high streets. We heard from Jenny. Organisations like Be the Business, helping with productivity. Business can step in too and is stepping in. So I think if we all do it together, we can answer the problems for the butchers, the bakers, but also the multinationals.
But just picking up on this point of demands on government, of course, the flip side of it is government doesn't have any money. Government is going to be paying off debt caused by the furlough scheme and everything else, ploughing money into the NHS for decades to come. This is we haven't had a financial situation like this since World War II. So asking for more money is tricky.
It is, absolutely. And, I don't envy the Chancellor's job in this respect, but I think he's been very clear. And one thing around the world you can be quite confident in, and that is if you have debt, it's going to be easy to repay that debt if you've got good, strong, solid, reliable growth. And at the moment, yes, there is a need to invest to secure that growth in the future. But if we don't make those investments, then it's going to be so much harder to repay that debt. So this is complicated stuff. We're not alone. So many countries around the world are facing into exactly this problem. And how we decide to deal with it will genuinely determine our prosperity for a generation and how we, the key government objective to level up the country. What better way than driving innovation, trade, and skills? It's absolutely worth it.
Maybe if I come back to Simon, talking about what business needs from government and what government needs from business. But if you had a checklist of things you would like to see, support, ideas, innovation that the government could provide you with, or is there anything you've seen from non-British governments that you think that was well handled? We'd like a bit of that. I don't know whether it's a German furlough system or a French system, whatever it might be. Have you seen any gold standards that have interested you?
I'm not sure I've seen any gold standards, but picking up on what the two previous panelists mentioned, so as Josh said, policy is better when it's hand in hand with business. So the role of business to rise up and join with people like the CBI to put forward policy suggestions that will improve STEM education, the role of trade, the focus on SMB, broadband capabilities, you name it. The two voices combined will be very powerful. I think one thing that was said earlier was the role of SMB, and I'd like to echo that. This topic is around trade and trade finance. The financing gap for SMBs around the world is somewhere in the region of $1.5 to $1.8 trillion. If we can help resolve that trade financing gap by bringing financial institutions and technology and policymakers together, not only would we promote our way out of this crisis by focusing on the SMB, we would improve global inclusiveness and global prosperity, and that would be a remarkable thing to achieve.
Jenny, I know a lot of discussion about the pandemic is, of course, the negative, and it is a crisis. It's had a huge toll on health, wealth, business, and so on. But of course, as many people have said already, there are opportunities for businesses at the moment. What advice would you give to businesses about those opportunities?
I mean, I think the advice is all about embracing digital economy. I mean, we've all kind of said it. We've accelerated into this new age. Have we gone 5 years in 6 months or 10 years in 6 months? It depends who you talk to, and it is here to stay. So I think the advice for businesses is work out how to embrace digital. There's a lot of help out there, and there's a lot of support, but it's going to be a fundamental part of the future, and embracing it is going to be really important.
Natalie, I don't want to be some sort of Pollyanna pretending it's all rosy at the moment. We know how difficult it is. But from your region, how would you take the temperature of the business world there and the bounce back that everybody's hoping for?
Well, Daisy, it's still relatively wait and see. We're starting to see numbers go up in a few countries across Asia Pacific. So everyone is absolutely playing for, they're hopeful that we're going to avoid a second wave of lockdowns, but we'll have to see how that works out. But I think you're seeing a degree of optimism and grabbing of opportunities. So particularly amongst the tech community, the number of startups is going up, for example. People are taking the opportunity of working from home to try that idea, which maybe they haven't thought about before. And the fact that so many of the bigger corporations are at the stage where they are really willing to enter into new partnerships. So you're seeing a lot of new ideas and new opportunities come out between the big guys and the small guys, which I think is really exciting. And back to your point about what can we learn, that's something we should keep an eye on, because everything has shown us over the last few months that partnership has to be at the center of what we do going forward. No one can tackle the pandemic alone, and no one can tackle the economic consequences of the pandemic alone. So partnerships in all their forms, whether that's government to government, government to business, business to business, whether that's about new trade deals that we're obviously pursuing in this part of the world, but also about bringing new companies out here and finding them new relationships. That's going to be absolutely central to the economic recovery, not only for the UK, but across Asia Pacific. So that's a real focus for the whole team out here at the moment.
And Simon, I wonder where fatigue fits into this picture, given that at the beginning of this pandemic, as each country went into some sort of lockdown, I think there was a sense of pulling together. It was a crisis and getting through it. And I wonder now, for some countries, 10 months later, but for others, 6 months later, as we are faced with a second lockdown and whatever that will mean for individuals, for consumer behaviour, for businesses, for the bottom line, whether a sense of fatigue is the thing that we need to be fighting against.
Yeah, that's a great question. We are seeing it we have 10,000 people more or less, all of whom are knowledge workers, and we are seeing a degree of fatigue set in. In fact, there's a whole language emerging around blue screen disease or blue screen eyes or special glasses that you need to wear. So we have to think about that. It's not just the physical well-being, it's also the mental well-being. So one thing that we're saying to our employees is the following. We're saying, you know what? The offices will be available, but it is your choice. Your manager cannot oblige you to go. It is your choice, down to the individual. That way, if somebody's at home and they need to escape from, an environment where they've got young children or grandparents, or there's 6 people in the room, there's many different circumstances. The offices are available. Likewise, there are people who are sadly in a situation of physical abuse. They need that exit to be able to get to an office just to feel safe, right? So we need to make it available, but not compulsory. And it then comes back to your point about fatigue and the future of work is what will the office be for? Now, what we found out when we survey the people is around 85% of them are terrified, petrified of getting back onto mass transit systems. They just don't want to hear about it, right? They're petrified. When they do get to the office, it's no longer to sit on a laptop, it was said earlier. It is to ideate, it is to collaborate. So we're going through the process right now, reconfiguring all our offices. So they're no longer offices, they're collaboration hubs. So the whole design is completely different. It's all about going there to ideate, to create, to collaborate, but not to work. Work they can do wherever they like. We're also thinking about working patterns where maybe one group of people work 4 days and then go home for 10. And then the next group come in for 4 days and then go home for 10. And that allows you to protect bubbles. But underpinning all of this there is a degree of fatigue, no doubt about it.
And Jenny, I wonder if there's consumer fatigue, because we're hearing a lot about pent-up demand, which is bubbling over in some sectors, whether it's construction or, just anecdotally, I've been hearing this week there is a lot of demand, certainly in London, for home building and decorating and new kitchens and all the rest of it. But that will be a short-term pent-up demand. And I wonder if there will then be a consumer fatigue that we should be expecting.
Yeah, maybe I think particularly in the northern hemisphere going into the winter, I think it's been a tough 6 months, but it feels even harder staring into winter when the walls that we do have are going to sort of close in a bit. We have seen some interesting trends though, and will they sustain? I don't know, but the home building DIY stores is not a London phenomena. I can tell you that is a global phenomena. So we have seen the category code of home building and DIY and garden centres being particularly strong right the way around the world. And right now that shows no sign of abating. One of the other things that's been particularly strong is people are saving. So people are moving their own money around. We're putting it into savings accounts. So for those lucky enough to still be in employment, and again, I worry about the next 6 months, but people are saving more money.
And Janice, I wonder about fatigue in leaders and leadership fatigue. Not just politicians, but anybody in a position of leadership who've been holding it together, leading the ship, and actually we might have another 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years ahead of us where it's going to be the same level of intensity. And I wonder what your feelings about that are.
I think that a lot of organizations are exactly having this conversation, having come through the first 6 or however many months of this new kind of working in this new world. How are we going to sustain? How are we going to sustain our organizations? How are we going to keep people motivated? How are we going to keep them healthy and resilient? And that does start with leaders taking care of themselves. And I think organizations that have those kind of conversations are going to be better off in the long run. And I think boards and public and private sector organizations can do that. But I think we can, there are some bright spots here. We can really take a lot of inspiration from the level of cooperation and collaboration and real energy that's coming in the health field. For instance, as we're seeing, the tremendous work on the development of vaccines and therapeutics happening faster and more internationally and more collaboratively than ever before, with the support of governments to make sure that those products can be made available. So let's actually take inspiration from that, which I think has a huge energizing value, and make sure that while we're doing that, we try and keep our societies, our economies, and our businesses as open as possible to the opportunities, whether it's in the world of global markets and taking advantage of free trade agreements, or global movements of people and keeping our countries open to being able to attract talent from around the world. That's Canada's success story, and we can't abandon that at this point.
Janice, thank you. Josh, I'm going to turn over to you for some final thoughts. Has this discussion cheered you up, depressed you, made you positive, negative? How's it left you feeling from a CBI perspective?
Look, I think it's been fantastic, and thank you for hosting, and thanks again to all of the panelists for coming. So much that we've touched on, but I think overall we have to feel to combat that danger of the sense of ennui, of tiredness. We have to feel optimistic. We've touched on the sort of potential around digitization, both in terms of at a firm level, but also in terms of trade deals and how it can be built in. We've touched on the need for government and business to work together. Absolutely right. But I suppose for me, the parting thought, if we want, exactly as Janice said, to inject energy, is that conversation about sustainability and that global conversation about faith in trade. That trade is there to lift people out of poverty, that it can drive a greener, more prosperous world. Look at exactly the example Janice gave around vaccines. Look at what can happen when countries work together in collaboration. It changes people's lives. It saves people's lives. And if we can capture that, the UK, president of G7, CBI, presidents of B7, we've got COP26. What an opportunity for us to show our values on the world stage, to actually be a player who drives that collaboration. Let's take it. Then we can get energized. Then we can really push forward. But thank you again, everybody, for taking part.
Well, Josh, thank you. And I think it's so nice to end on an optimistic note, because there hasn't been an awful lot of that about for the last 6 months. So, Josh, thank you very much. And of course, I have to say a very big thank you to Janice, to Natalie, to Simon, and to Jenny. And also to you for your time and your insights, and for watching today. I'm very, very grateful. Do stay tuned, because next up we have the live discussion with Dame Carolyn Fairbairn, of course, from the CBI, who'll be in conversation with the Right Honourable Liz Truss MP, Secretary of State for International Trade. That's not to be missed.